Hello, I'm Dr. Harper. This video is in project management. It's a lecture video on an overview of communications management. So let's bring up the notes. In communications management can be described in this PM Box 6th edition. It's the management includes the processes to ensure generation, collection, dissemination, storage, and disposition of project information. And there are three major processes, and we'll look at all three of them briefly as far as an overview is concerned. But before we get into the details, let me talk about the key statements on project communications, which I think is paramount in project management. And this is why communications has its own knowledge area. Four key statements. One, the most frequent cause of project failure is attributed to poor communications. Now that doesn't mean that just because you don't communicate, then that's why it failed. But a cause could be, well, if I had maybe didn't have enough money, or there was miscommunication, maybe it was financial, maybe it was a schedule was disrupted, maybe a vendor didn't do what they're supposed to do. But the communication, if we had known about that within communications, we could have done something about it. The second is good communications can save a bad project with good people. Bad communications can jeopardize a good project, even with good people. Every successful project requires inclusive communications internally and externally. Inclusive, meaning everyone understands, everyone is involved with communications internally within the project and externally with the external stakeholders. And fourth, approximate amount of time a project manager spends on communication is 90%. And so it's important. Good communication can save a bad project. Every successful project requires it, but also a good project manager, successful project, can spend approximately 90% of the time on communications, internally and externally. So having said that, this lecture will have, going through these three processes, I start with a background of communication channels or nodes, the different models of communication and technology. And then under the communications plan, we'll have the people, process, purpose, and the plan, who, what, when, how, why. We'll talk about how to put that together. And then managing your communications, ensure the communication plan is implemented correctly. And then monitoring communication, ensure the communication plan meets its objectives. And there's where you have change control, etc. So let's get into it. First of all, the primary communication channels. And this is important to note simply because when you start adding people to the communication plan, you're increasing the number of channels enormously. And we'll look at efficient ways on how to handle that. First of all, suppose we had the primary communication channels of the project manager, the stakeholders, external, which is outsourcing, and internal, the project. Well, there's four different nodes. Well, how many different two-way channels are there between four nodes? Well, the simple equation is n times n minus 1 over 2. So we have four nodes. N minus 1 is 3. 3 times 4 is 12. Divided by 2 is 6. And so when you start counting them up, project manager has 3. But then external and internal have 1 here. And then external and stakeholder and internal stakeholder. When you start counting those up, that's 6. So the communication model. Well, if you start thinking about this with experience, you begin to realize, yeah, this is very true. You can experience this. You can see results of this. And that is, you have a source of communication, and that source will be encoded somehow. And we'll talk about the encoding modes of coding, verbal, written, email, whatever. But then through that encode will be projected a perception of the content, a personality of the sender, the attitudes, the emotions, prejudices. In other words, the way it's encoded and the way it's sent quite often will have different types of attributes. But then whatever is sent, it has to be decoded to the receiver. And then they receive it and they'll decode it, and then they have a perception on what's happening and a personality between their personality and the sender. Like, what are they talking about? And you think of the person. And so even though you have communication channels within a project, if you know the person personally, then the decoding and the interpretation will have the person in mind. Otherwise, it's generic. And so you have to keep that in mind when you send communications. But then you have a source of communication back, and it goes back. So you have back and forth two-way communications. So notice I refer to these as barriers and screens. Barriers because you can only send certain things in a communication. You might try to send what you mean, but sometimes there's a barrier on how you send it. It's very difficult, and sometimes it's a barrier sending through things by email by trying to express a correct emotion if the emotion is very specific or complicated. And sometimes it's a screen. Now, it'll screen and filter out things. It screens out things or let things go through partial, and you'll know communication is important if it's within context. But if you start screening things out in a communication, sometimes that can be taken out of context because all of that is not there. And sometimes it's a natural screening process of how things are communicated. Okay. Now, the communications plan. Here is how to put this together and briefly, generally, as an overview. You have who, what, when, how, why, and then comments. And so you have different items down here. Now, remember, the communication plan is extremely important because communication is the lifeblood of an organization. The communication, how things keep going on a number of levels. One is knowing what to do. The other is knowing I've done what I was supposed to do. The other is I'm doing something important because everyone is recognizing it. And so communication is important. Okay, first of all, who? Well, it could be the stakeholders, it could be team members and suppliers, and make sure you identify exactly who's getting it. That will determine the rest of the communication plan. What you tell stakeholders is different than team members, is different than suppliers, for example. Content. Are they updates? Is it to initiate the work, like for the team members? Is it changes that need to be done, either to the stakeholders for their validation or verification, or suppliers? A level of detail. Well, there's going to be more detail to the team members than to key stakeholders. There's going to be more detail to the team members actually doing the work than the stakeholders who just need to be informed. Appropriateness. You tell people what they need to know. Don't tell people what they don't need to know, because it can cause confusion and problems. And if someone wants to know, then that's fine. It's appropriate. But then you can put it in context. And then time dependent. Well, sometimes when do you do it? Sometimes it's frequency. I'm giving a report every Friday. Every Friday we get together and review what we're doing and plan what we do next week. So it could be very frequent. It could be project dependent. Well, we have phase one, the end of phase one, we're going to have a communication and say what we did, have different milestones. And when milestones happen, then we're going to actually state what we have done. Why? Well, you can inform, say, stakeholders. You can approve stakeholders, initiate work, team members, coordinate work between team members and, say, suppliers, quality assurance, direct the schedules that need to be done. So there's why are you communicating this? What's the purpose of communicating? And there's where appropriateness comes in. You communicate what is appropriate depending on why you're communicating it. Okay, what you're communicating, why you're communicating it, that's how you're going to communicate it. And then how? Written, verbal, formal, informal. There's a lot more different channels than this, a lot more modes of communication than this. I picked these four because it's a very good start as an overview. In other words, for written or verbal, and I have oral or written, you can have formal and informal, informal and formal. Well, informal oral communication would be a personal contact. And that's just one-on-one usually, like you meet in the hall. Oh, I sent you this. And so usually who and why, it's usually very, very, very short. It's something that they need to know, like you're meeting each other in the hall. I do this all the time. It's, oh, by the way, I sent you this. I'm sending you this because of this. Oh, okay, fine. I'll read it when I get it. Or I forwarded an email from here because this kind of thing. Or something oral can be explained with emotion that can't be explained in written. Okay, then the informal written is memos or email. Okay, and so when you put things down, first of all, over here, let's go this way. Formal in meetings. So oral in a meeting where you're physically there. And so again, you have the people coming to the meeting who should be there. Here's why you're here, and we'll talk about meeting organization later. But the formal oral communication means I'm having a meeting because everyone needs to know this. And I'm having a meeting to tell you personally, so now I know you know, and I want you to understand why I'm saying it and more of an understanding of what's being said. And so oral can give flexibility and speed and understanding, but also the disadvantage, it could be misunderstood. Okay, I want to emphasize that this needs to be done. Well, why? Was I doing it wrong before? And so you can correct those misunderstandings in person, either in a meeting or personal contact. Now, written, informal written would be emails or memos or just jotting down notes. Who and why? Well, who is very specific. You want them to know exactly what this is. Why? Sometimes to document. Notice the advantage of documentation. You want to document what you said. So therefore, in business, I recommend, and even in projects, never email opinions, never email things that are never sent in a memo, or email opinions or conclusions that could change unless you qualify it as such. Based on this information, this is what I would decide. You don't just say, I think Joe should be fired. Oh, I think Mary should retire. You don't say those things. John Doe, Jane Doe. I don't want to use any names here. You don't think John Doe should be fired or Jane Doe should retire. You don't say that because I don't like them. You don't put that in an email because always think in business and in projects, once you have something written, assume, and it leaves your desk, assume it'll always be there forever and ever and ever. People can pull it out a day later, a week later, a month later, a year later, and say, but you said this. And whether they do it or not, they can go back and look. So be very careful what you document to make sure it's not going to change. So you document facts, you document instructions, you document the conclusions or takeaways of meetings. Here's what we decided. Here is our action items. Here's our table items, and you put it in an email. And so sometimes you'll have a formal meeting and you'll follow up with minutes. So you'll document what is said and you vote on the minutes. Yes, I agree. And so, yes, that was said, but I think that's misrepresented. And then finally, the formal written would be reports. Now the reports, why and who? Reports are usually a much broader audience, and it's for anyone to whom it may concern. Why? Is to establish from the beginning, the middle, and the end, everything that needs to be established that you know at the time in that communication. Now, the advantage is documentation. You're going to be documenting what's being said, but also the disadvantage is use of resources. Now, what I mean by resources is time, effort, use of resources as far as material resources. If you're going to create a report, you're going to create people are going to edit the report. publish a report, and there's going to be paper, there's going to be publishing costs, and could be monetary costs and material resources. So it's a disadvantage, and so only do what needs to be done, this kind of thing. And so think about how this should be done. Now, as communications continue within a project, usually the project manager will direct what's appropriate, when, where, and how. And whatever is appropriate, that will create a certain culture within the project. In other words, if it's going to be frequent, and that frequent is written in memos, make sure you keep doing that, because that's a culture. And once that's broken, all of a sudden, that becomes a culture of distrust at the worst case scenario. Okay, key elements. The process. Plan for communications and follow the plan. Sometimes the process of communication is more important than what's being communicated. You create a plan and follow the plan, and that process again creates the culture. Sometimes that's much more important than, and even if you plan for communications, follow the plan, and say, oh, there's nothing to communicate, and so at this point, I'm not communicating anything, there's nothing to be said, then you follow the plan. So that's a very important communication because it's correct. You have nothing to report. But the process becomes extremely important to create culture. Inclusive. And this is important in projects. Everyone is involved. Everyone is included at some time, in some way, at some level, and there's where appropriateness comes in. So make sure everyone is communicated one time or the other. Appropriate. Appropriate information to the appropriate people in the appropriate manner. For example, if you're trying to communicate to a very large number of people on a routine basis, you have something called a push communication. And push communication is information sent to appropriate individuals. Say, I'm going to push this to everyone. Like, here's my announcement to everyone. In this course, in my online courses, I can make announcements. The announcement is to the entire class, everyone in the class, and everyone should read that. And it's usually to everyone. Now, if I have a communication to an individual, I might use an email. Okay, but then a push communication is made to everyone. Now, a pull communication is appropriate information made available to access. Pull communication says, okay, if you want to know how to submit a grievance, I'm not going to push that to everyone, but I want to make it available here so you can go get that anytime you want. Here are the bylaws. Here's the Constitution. Here is all of the rules and regulations we have. I'm not going to send this multi-page document to everyone, but it's here for anyone who wants to come and access it. That's called a pull communication. You make it available, and you tell them where to go get it. Okay. Now, interactive is a two-way exchange of information. In other words, this video is a one-way. Zoom will be two ways, and so you can have a two-way exchange of information. And there's where it can be permanent, formal, non-permanent, or informal. And so the non-permanent, informal, there's where emotion and attitudes can come in. But the formal two-way, you should be more businesslike and stick to the objectives. As examples, the supplier. Well, what would you communicate? A purchase order. Why? Requirement. Because of compliance. Stakeholder. Let's say a key stakeholder. Update them on what's happening. Why? Well, they have interest in what's happening because they're a stakeholder and they need to know. A team member. You might communicate to them performance measurement, some kind of a performance measure. Why? Well, to motivate them and to get a commitment. The project team as a whole, okay, may be a push communication for lessons learned. Why? For productivity, for the future, and developing the project team to move forward. So here's an example of examples of within a communication plan. Now, finally, managing meetings. A lot of people say, oh, I hate meetings. Well, maybe you hate the meetings because they're not really done well. or they're not done correctly or appropriately. A good meeting, you come and you leave and you feel informed, you feel good, and you feel empowered. A good meeting can be positive. And you're supposed to be there. Like, why did I have to hear that? That kind of thing. Okay, first of all, planning. Well, plan the necessity of the meeting. Make sure it has a purpose. What's the outcome? The attendance is important. The agenda is important. The logistics. Where's it going to be? When's it going to be? So the planning, all these things need to be part of the planning. And so if you send out an email and say, or push email and say, we're gonna have a meeting. We're gonna have a meeting this week. Okay, when this week? Conducting. When you conduct the meeting, you have a protocol, a process. Make sure you're aware of how this meeting should be conducted. You have rules to follow, like Robert's Rules of Order. And then finally, you'll have cultural influences. So the culture of a meeting is going to be very important on how the rules can be accepted and the protocol will progress in a positive manner. Okay, finally, guidelines. I like these. And I wish I could send these to a lot of people who conduct meetings that I'm in. And I have been in meetings that they're very, very good at. Very good meetings. Sometimes not so much. Guidelines. Start the meeting with the agenda. Reasons for the meeting and the results desired. Here's why we're here, and here's what we're going to have when we're done. So start the meeting with an agenda. An agenda says the reason you have the meeting, here's what we're doing, and here's the results at the end. That's why we're here. This is where we're going. 2, this is important. Start on time. How many times I say, people are still showing up. Let's wait till more people get here. And sometimes that's okay. I'm not saying strict, but to me personally, personal bias, start on time and finish early. And I say that and then I joke because a lot of times in my courses and my classes, I'll start telling going deeper and deeper into it. And sometimes I'm a little bit late on my courses, so I don't even do this. But a course is instruction. It's not necessarily a meeting. It is a meeting, but it's not like a business meeting. Make sure that in your agenda, you know what needs to be done, and you have time, more time than you need to do it, to make sure you finish early. Starting on time. I want to emphasize this. This is a personal bias of mine. Start on time. Let's say that you've invited 10 people to the meeting and then 2 people show up. So do you wait or do you start the meeting? Well, the meeting was supposed to start on time. Let's say you're going to have a 10 o'clock meeting. 2 people show up, 8 people didn't show up. Do you start the meeting and you say, you 2 who were here on time and you're ready to go, let's just wait till the other people come. And sometimes that's acceptable and says, okay, fine. They're going to be okay with that because they're on time. They have their act together. Maybe, maybe not. But they got there when they were supposed to be there. The other 8 are not there when they're supposed to be there. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, I can't help but think this because the first job I had, they were very strict on being on time. And so do you make the 2 who are responsible, and that's in quotes. Okay, I'm being a little bit dramatic here. You're the 2 who are responsible. You're penalizing them to make them wait for the 8 who are irresponsible. I was in a company I was in an organization one time where they required you to be on time. And we were in a research group, and we had, if we were late, we noted. They would note, you are late, and here's how many minutes late you are. And what they would do, and we were told this too, don't be late, be early. They would take how many minutes late we are, on how many people are there when we showed up. They took the minutes times the number of people that those people were here and you weren't. they took those minutes and allocated them as a penalty, funny money. Oh, and then they took the hourly rate of consulting, which was a lot of money back then, hourly rate of consulting on how many hours you made the group wait and not have your input. And then they allocated that as a cost to that person. And at the end of a pay period, they had, it's funny money, it wasn't real money, but it was virtual money, saying, so here's how much money these people, and this person had this much. Well, they're not very responsible. And if someone was consistently irresponsible, they were removed because they're not really contributing to the productivity of our research. They are undermining it. So they were gone. Interesting. So it was ingrained in me, be there early. Okay, be there on time. Okay, that was probably a lot more information that should be on that one little part of this lecture. Let's go on. List your action items up front and list your action items in the tabled items. In other words, at the end of the meeting, like the results desired, here's what we want. Well, the action item says, okay, we're going to be doing this from our results or objectives. But then we're going to table these items and do them later. So make sure that is very clear. This is what we're doing, and this is what we're tabling. Very clear before you leave. And finally, claim victory. You can either state the obvious, like this is a good meeting, or inject a spin. It says, okay, well, this wasn't as predictive as I thought, but we did make progress, and hopefully in the future we can learn from this and get better. Okay, inject a spin on it. Okay, finally, the types of meetings. It could be scheduled, frequent meeting, a routine meeting, or an ad hoc meeting. The scheduled meeting could be a kickoff meeting to start the project, a review meeting, which could be routine, periodic, or changes. Changes need to be made, could be ad hoc because we have changes. The purpose of the meeting, necessary elements, the attendees, who's coming, and the outcome. And I pretty much said that up here already, but I repeat it because at least here's why we're here. Here is the people who are supposed to be here, and this is what we're going to be doing. Okay, issues. Well, the process sometimes is more important than the product. So the protocol is going to be very, very important. The rules, make sure you have a standardization of rules and allocate the rules equally, equitably, with all people there, so the rules are there to be followed. You follow the rules for everyone, and if you don't, identify why. Okay, Robert's Rules of Order says this, but we're not doing it this time because of this. Okay, and if you're the moderator, if you're the leader, then you can make, and it's permissible. In other words, the rules create standardization of a protocol. So make sure that the rules are standardized and understood and followed. Finally, culture. The culture of inclusion. Don't let the protocol or the rules, the process or standardized rules, exclude anyone in that meeting. Make sure everyone's included. Create a culture that everyone is going to be heard. And no matter who they are, no matter if what they're saying is right or wrong or violent or emotional or not, everyone can be heard. Okay, and so the meetings are important. If done correctly, they can be very valuable and very helpful and motivating. And actually, as a matter of fact, I enjoy most meetings. I enjoy meetings because I begin to see personalities of people coming out. I take these under human resources and people and people watching, and I just say, try to evaluate the people at the meeting. So sometimes the meetings can be very helpful and entertaining. Sometimes I am entertained. Okay. One thing I did not mention here, speaking of entertainment, is humor. Humor is extremely important if done correctly and appropriately. And I should put this in here, but humor is important because humor is a device for social connection. And if you can make people laugh, well, then you've connected. And so sometimes that's important. And but this is what I have under the overview of communications management. The next time I see you, I'm going to encourage everyone to be very, very careful, be safe.